The dust-laden air of Bitterroot Valley hung heavy as Ruby Galloway clutched her mother's golden locket, her last remaining possession of value, while three men circled her ranch like vultures eyeing a carcass. It was 1878, and the harsh Montana Territory had claimed everything else: her parents to typhoid fever, the crops to drought, and now her home to mounting debts that seemed to multiply like weeds after a spring rain. "Miss Galloway, I reckon you understand your situation," said Herbert Vaughn, the cattle baron who owned half the valley, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your father's debts need settling, and I'm offering a fair price for this land plus 20 head of prime cattle." "That's more than generous considering the circumstances." Ruby stood on the porch of the small homestead her father had built with his own hands, her auburn hair whipping against her face in the wind. At 22, she had never imagined fighting for her very existence against men like Vaughn. "This land is all I have left, Mr. Vaughn. My father worked himself to death for it. I need more time," she pleaded, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. Vaughn exchanged knowing glances with his companions. "Time doesn't pay debts, Miss Galloway. I'll give you until the end of the week to consider my offer." His eyes drifted meaningfully toward the small corral where Starlight, her prized Palomino mare, grazed peacefully. "That's a fine horse. I'd add her to my offer, but I expect you'll want to keep something to remember your father by." After they rode away, Ruby sank to the porch steps, desperation clawing at her throat. 3 days. She had 3 days to conjure a miracle. The next morning dawned with the kind of golden light that makes even the harshest landscape appear beautiful. Ruby was gathering eggs when she heard the approach of hoofbeats. Her heart sank, expecting Vaughn had returned early to pressure her further. Instead, a lone rider appeared, his lean frame silhouetted against the rising sun. As he drew closer, she could make out his weather-beaten hat and the dust coating his denim clothes. He rode with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. "Morning, madam," he called, stopping a respectful distance from the house. "Name's Griffin Quinn." "I heard you might be looking for hired help." Ruby studied him cautiously. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a jawline hardened by years of frontier living. Most importantly, he didn't carry the predatory look of Vaughn's men. "Who told you that?" She questioned, keeping the henhouse door between them. "Widow Johnson in town said you might be struggling since your folks passed." He dismounted, keeping his hands visible. "I'm handy with livestock, can fix most anything that breaks, and I'm not afraid of honest work." Ruby almost laughed at the bitter irony. "Mr. Quinn, I'm afraid you've wasted your time. I can barely feed myself, let alone pay wages." Griffin removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "I'm not asking for much, Miss Galloway. A place to sleep and meals will do for now. Been riding a long spell, and I could use somewhere to winter." She hesitated. Having a man around might discourage Vaughn's intimidation tactics, but taking in a stranger carried its own risks. "What are you running from, Mr. Quinn?" She asked bluntly. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Not running from, madam, running to. I've been drifting too long looking for something worth stopping for." He gestured at the struggling homestead. "This looks like honest work, and I could use some of that." Against her better judgment, Ruby found herself agreeing. "The barn has a small room. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it. I can only promise 1 meal a day, Mr. Quinn." "Griffin," he corrected. "And that'll do fine." By midday, Griffin had already repaired the chicken coop, patched a leak in the roof, and was examining the broken-down plow. Ruby watched from the kitchen window, both grateful for and suspicious of this timely arrival. At supper, she finally asked the question that had been haunting her all day. "How much do you know about Herbert Vaughn?" Griffin's expression darkened. "Enough to know he didn't build his empire by playing fair." "Why do you ask?" Ruby explained her situation: the mounting debts, Vaughn's offer, and the rapidly approaching deadline. "He means to have this land one way or another," Griffin said thoughtfully. This valley's got the best water rights for 50 miles. Vaughn's been buying up every parcel he can. He offered 20 head of cattle as part of the deal, Ruby said, pushing her stew around her plate. Griffin's gaze sharpened. Did he now? And did he mention where you'd graze these cattle, seeing as he'd own your land? The reality of Vaughn's deception hit Ruby like a physical blow. He's offering me nothing at all, isn't he? Less than nothing. He's counting on you not understanding the business. Griffin leaned forward. Miss Galloway, how much do you owe exactly? $230 to the bank in Helena. Another $100 to the mercantile in town. She swallowed hard. My father took loans for seed and equipment last spring before the drought hit. Griffin nodded slowly. That's a sum to be sure, but not impossible. What if you had another option? Unless you've got $300 hidden in that saddle of yours, Mr. Quinn, I don't see one. Not money, he said. But I've got experience breaking horses for the cavalry. That mare of yours, Starlight, is it? She's quality stock. If we had more like her, we could start a breeding operation. Army's always looking for good mounts. Hope flickered briefly before reality doused it. That takes time we don't have. Vaughn will be back in 2 days. Then we need to buy that time, Griffin said firmly. I know some folks who might lend a hand if asked proper. The following morning, Griffin rode into town while Ruby tended to the daily chores. When he returned near dusk, he brought news that made her heart race. I spoke with Judge Wilson. He says Vaughn's been pushing the boundaries of the law for years, but no one stood up to him. The judge is willing to file an injunction to review your father's debts, claims there may have been irregularities in the interest charged. Ruby's eyes widened. What irregularities? Doesn't matter, Griffin said with a wink. What matters is it buys us 30 days while the court reviews the paperwork. Judge Wilson's no friend of Vaughn's. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Ruby felt a flutter of something besides despair. Why would the judge help me? Griffin's expression softened. Because I told him what Vaughn's really after. This land sits above an underground spring that feeds half the valley. In a drought year like this one, whoever controls that water controls everything. When Vaughn returned 2 days later, flanked by 6 men including his son Jasper, Ruby met him with newfound confidence and Judge Wilson's court order in hand. Vaughn's face contorted with rage as he read the document. This changes nothing. It only delays the inevitable. Perhaps, Ruby replied coolly. Or perhaps it gives me time to find alternatives to your generous offer. Vaughn's gaze shifted to Griffin, who stood silently at Ruby's side. And who might this be? Griffin Quinn, he answered for himself. Miss Galloway's new ranch manager. A cruel smile spread across Vaughn's face. Quinn, the same Quinn who had that unpleasantness down in Wyoming territory, seems your reputation precedes you. Ruby glanced at Griffin, whose expression remained impassive despite the muscle ticking in his jaw. Past is past, Griffin replied evenly. I'm just helping a neighbor now. As Vaughn and his men prepared to leave, Jasper Vaughn, a young man with his father's ambition but none of his restraints, spurred his horse close to the porch. You'd best reconsider, Miss Galloway. My father's patience isn't unlimited and Quinn here can't protect you forever. After they departed, Ruby turned to Griffin, questions forming on her lips, but he spoke first. We've got 30 days. Let's make them count. Over the next weeks, Griffin and Ruby worked from dawn until dusk. He taught her about horse breeding, showing her how to recognize quality traits that would appeal to buyers. Together they repaired fences, cleared fields, and prepared the small homestead for winter. Word spread throughout the valley about Ruby's stand against Vaughn. To her surprise, neighbors she barely knew began stopping by bringing a spare wagon wheel, a sack of feed, or offers of help with the harvest. Many had their own grievances against Vaughn but had never dared challenge him alone. Griffin proved to be more than just a skilled ranch hand. His knowledge of horses was unparalleled, and buyers from as far as Fort Benton began expressing interest in Starlight's future foals once they heard about her bloodline. She's descended from cavalry stock. Griffin explained one evening as they brushed down the Palomino mare. Her grandsire was an officer's mount during the war. Horses like her are rare out here. Ruby watched his gentle hands move over the horse's flank. How do you know so much about her? Griffin hesitated. I knew your father, Ruby. Not well, but we crossed paths when I was driving cattle north from Texas 4 years back. He was proud of this little mare, showed her off to anyone who'd listen. The revelation that Griffin had some connection to her father both comforted and confused Ruby. Why didn't you tell me? Wasn't sure you'd trust me if I did. His eyes met hers. Didn't want you thinking I had ulterior motives. And do you? She challenged, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the dim light of the barn. Griffin's gaze softened. None that would hurt you. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings that had been growing during their weeks of shared labor and purpose. Ruby turned away first, her cheeks flushed. We should finish the evening chores. As their 30-day reprieve neared its end, Ruby and Griffin had managed to secure promises from 3 Army purchasing agents to inspect Starlight and potentially contract for future foals. They had also arranged to sell some of the timber from the north section of the property, enough to cover the mercantile debt. But despite their progress, they remained short of the bank payment, and Vaughn had not been idle. He'd pressured the bank to refuse any extension and had been buying up debts from other creditors to strengthen his position. The night before their deadline, Ruby and Griffin sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. We've done everything possible, Ruby said, her voice steady despite her fear. If it's not enough. Griffin took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. Ruby, there's something I need to tell you. Before he could continue, they heard the unmistakable sound of approaching riders. Griffin was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the pistol at his hip. 5 riders emerged from the darkness, but they weren't Vaughn's men. Leading them was a broad-shouldered man with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Griffin Quinn, called the marshal. I have a warrant for your arrest from Wyoming territory, charges of rustling and murder. Ruby gasped, staring at Griffin in disbelief. It's not what you think, he said quietly to her, before raising his voice to the marshal. I've been expecting you, Marshal Hayes. Though your timing leaves something to be desired. Surrender your weapon and come peacefully, the marshal ordered. Griffin complied, handing over his gun. I'm entitled to explain myself to Miss Galloway before you take me in. The marshal nodded grimly. Make it quick, we're riding tonight. Inside the house, with the marshal standing guard by the door, Griffin finally told Ruby the truth. I was foreman for the Circle T Ranch in Wyoming. The owner, James Tucker, was a good man who treated his hands fair. His daughter was set to marry a man named Edward Vaughn. Ruby's eyes widened. Vaughn, Herbert's nephew, Griffin confirmed. Edward was cut from the same cloth as his uncle, greedy, cruel, willing to do anything for power. When James died suddenly, Edward took control of the ranch through his engagement to Tucker's daughter. Griffin's face hardened with the memory. He started rustling cattle from neighboring ranches, slaughtering some for quick profit and rebranding others. When I discovered what he was doing, I confronted him. That night, 3 hands who'd remained loyal to Tucker's memory were shot in their beds. Edward claimed I'd done it in a dispute over wages. You ran, Ruby stated, beginning to understand. I had to. Edward had the local law in his pocket, just like his uncle does here. I've been tracking the Vaughns ever since, gathering evidence of their crimes. Griffin leaned forward intently. Ruby, Herbert Vaughn sent for me. He recognized my name when he heard it in town and telegraphed Wyoming. He wants me gone because I'm the only one who knows what his family is capable of. The marshal cleared his throat from the doorway. Time's up, Quinn. As Griffin was led away, Ruby felt as though the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. The man she'd come to rely on, perhaps even love, was being taken from her on the eve of her greatest challenge. I'll come back for you, Griffin called over his shoulder. Whatever happens tomorrow, don't give up the fight. Ruby barely slept that night. By dawn, she had made her decision. Saddling Starlight, she rode into town to face Herbert Vaughn at the bank. The cattle baron was already there, smug triumph on his face as he sat beside the bank manager. "Miss Galloway, right on time. I trust you're ready to sign the transfer of deed. I've even brought the cattle I promised, though I assume you'll be selling them back to me at a discount." Ruby stood tall, drawing strength from everything Griffin had taught her. "Actually, Mr. Vaughn, I've come to settle my debts in full." Vaughn's eyebrows rose. "Is that so? And how do you intend to accomplish this miracle?" "By exposing you for what you are," Ruby replied, pulling a packet of papers from her saddlebag. "These are copies of documents Griffin Quinn has gathered over the past year, evidence of how you and your nephew have systematically defrauded ranchers across 2 territories. Vaughn's face darkened. "Quinn is a wanted criminal. His word means nothing." "Perhaps." But Judge Wilson found his evidence compelling enough to launch an investigation, as did Marshal Hayes. Ruby placed the papers on the bank manager's desk. "These include records of how you manipulated interest rates on loans to struggling ranchers, including my father's." The bank manager nervously adjusted his spectacles as he scanned the documents. "Mr. Vaughn, these appear to show significant irregularities in the loan calculations." Vaughn slammed his fist on the desk. "This is absurd. You can't believe the fabrications of a rustler and murderer." "Interesting you should mention murder," came a new voice from the doorway. Marshal Hayes entered, followed by 2 deputies. "Mr. Vaughn, we've received testimony from your former bookkeeper connecting you to the death of James Tucker in Wyoming Territory. He's quite eager to reduce his own sentence." As Vaughn sputtered denials, Ruby felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found Griffin unshackled and standing free. "How?" she began. "The marshal and I reached an understanding on the ride to town," Griffin explained with a small smile. "Seems Edward Vaughn's crimes finally caught up with him. The real murderer confessed." Events moved quickly after that. Vaughn was taken into custody pending investigation, and the bank manager, eager to distance himself from the scandal, recalculated Ruby's loan under the proper terms. The new amount was covered by the timber sale and advance payments from the Army horse contracts. 2 days later, as Ruby and Griffin stood watching the sunset from her porch, free and clear now, Jasper Vaughn rode up alone, his face twisted with hatred. "You've ruined my family," he spat, dismounting and stalking toward them. "My father will hang because of you." "Your father ruined himself," Griffin replied calmly, stepping between Ruby and the angry young man. Jasper drew his pistol. "I'll take what's ours one way or another. The Galloway woman can sign over her water rights to me, or neither of you will live to see morning." Ruby moved beside Griffin. "I'll never sell to a Vaughn." "Then I'll take your precious horse instead," Jasper sneered, gesturing toward the corral where Starlight stood. "She'll fetch a good price from the slaughterhouse." "Don't sell her for cattle," Ruby cried, genuine fear in her voice. Griffin's hand moved to his own weapon, his eyes never leaving Jasper's. "I'll pay with my life to keep her safe," he said firmly, "but I don't think it'll come to that." Before Jasper could respond, the sound of multiple riders approaching drew their attention. Marshal Hayes and several townspeople appeared, having followed Jasper from town. "Lower your weapon, Vaughn," ordered the marshal. "You're only making things worse for yourself." Jasper hesitated, his hand trembling before finally dropping his gun to the dirt. As he was led away, he cast one final venomous look at Ruby and Griffin. "This isn't over." "Yes," Griffin said quietly, "it is." That evening, as peace settled over the homestead, Ruby and Griffin sat close together on the porch swing her father had built years ago. "You never told me what brought you here in the first place," Ruby said, her head resting on his shoulder. "Was it really just to track the Vaughns?" Griffin was silent for a moment, his fingers gently intertwined with hers. "Partly, but when I heard about a stubborn red-headed woman fighting to save her father's legacy all on her own, I knew I had to meet her." He smiled down at her. "Some things are worth risking everything for, like a horse." Ruby teased, referring to his declaration to Jasper. "Like a home," Griffin corrected softly. Like you. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of things to come, sealed beneath the vast Montana sky. Spring came to Bitterroot Valley with unusual generosity. The drought broke, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and starlight delivered a strong colt with promising bloodlines. Ruby and Griffin worked side by side, transforming the struggling homestead into a thriving horse ranch. Word spread about the quality of their stock, and by summer, they had orders from cavalry units across the Western Territories. The Galloway Quinn Horse Ranch became known for producing animals with both spirit and stamina qualities that Griffin claimed they'd learned from Ruby herself. On a perfect June evening, 1 year after Griffin had first ridden onto her land, he took Ruby to the highest point on the property, where the entire valley spread before them in lush green splendor. "I've been thinking," he said, uncharacteristically nervous, "about building an addition to the house. Something with more rooms, perhaps a larger kitchen." Ruby smiled, already guessing his intentions. "Planning on taking in boarders, Mr. Quinn. Planning on raising a family, Miss Galloway." He dropped to one knee, presenting her with a simple gold band that caught the setting sunlight. "If you'll have me." "I believe I will," she answered, pulling him to his feet and into her arms, "though I should warn you Galloways are known for their stubbornness." "And Quinns for their persistence," he countered, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of partnership. Their wedding that autumn was attended by half the valley, many of them former victims of Vaughn's schemes who had reclaimed their own lands after his downfall. Judge Wilson presided, Marshal Hayes stood as Griffin's best man, and Starlight wore a garland of wildflowers for the occasion. As years passed, the legend of how Ruby and Griffin had stood against the most powerful man in the territory grew with each telling. Their 4 children grew up hearing stories of courage and conviction, of fighting for what's right even when the odds seem insurmountable. But in the quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Ruby and Griffin would often sit on that same porch swing, watching the stars emerge over their hard-won paradise. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Ruby asked on their 10th anniversary, her head resting on his shoulder just as it had that first night. Griffin's arm tightened around her. "Every day. If I'd arrived a day later, if you'd given in to Vaughn, if the marshal hadn't believed my evidence. If you hadn't been willing to risk everything for a stubborn woman and her horse," Ruby added with a smile. "Best risk I ever took," Griffin declared, kissing the top of her head. "Though I still maintain I was never risking much at all." "No," Ruby raised an eyebrow. "Facing down an armed man doesn't count as risk." Griffin's eyes, still as stormy blue as the day they'd met, grew serious. "Not when the alternative was losing you. Some things are worth any price, Ruby Quinn. You taught me that." As the moon rose over Bitterroot Valley, casting silver light over the prosperous ranch that had once teetered on the edge of ruin, Ruby reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From desperate strangers to partners to lovers to family, their story had become part of the valley's lore, a testament to resilience and the power of standing firm for what you believe in. And every night, before they retired to the house they had built together, Ruby would whisper a prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought a lone cowboy to her door on the very day she needed him most.